Okay, let's find out who these post-impressionists are, obviously following the impressionists. Many of them actually were impressionist at one point, and they kind of like just hung up their cleats, if you will, and they said, nah, we need to do a little more investigation on painting and not just require quick sketch-like images. So essentially, they thought that quick sketches of Impressionism were losing important elements in painting and traditional elements in painting, for example, line and color and pattern and form. Those are the main things. They felt that these sketch-like qualities, and if you look back at the Impressionist paintings, you'll see that there's not an emphasis heavily on line or on form or on pattern or really modeling of color, transitioning one color to another color. So they want to re-emphasize all of these different what are called visual elements. Okay, so line, pattern, form, and color are all visual elements, and you use visual elements like stacking blocks, if you will, like little pieces of Legos, to build what's called a design principle, right? So with the use of these visual elements, which are your basic building blocks to any composition, any painting, any sculpture, any architecture, you require these visual elements. So they're going to go back to square one, so to speak, and re-emphasize. But there's going to be two different types of focus. There's going to be an expressive focus on line, pattern, color, and then there's going to be an analytical focus. And your expressive artist that we're going to look at is going to be Van Gogh in particular, right? Van Gogh. And, and then with your analytical, meaning more, more mathematical in nature, is we're going to look at Seurat and Cezanne. All right, so we'll look at Van Gogh for what he does with these basic visual elements to make it more expressive. All right, to use line in an expressive way, to use color in an expressive way, to use form in an expressive way. And then Cezanne and Seurat are going to use all of those different visual elements in an analytical way. All right, kind of breaking it down mathematical a bit. Now remember, the Impressionists were all about criticizing, or this modernist movement was all about criticizing what's been done like yesterday. So the post-impressionists were, during this time, very quickly criticizing what the Impressionism was all about, and then they became post-impressionist. We're going to start with Seurat. So let's begin with figure 28.18, and we're also going to go back at 28.17. All right, 28.17 is a detail of 28.18, which is a Sunday on La Grande Jatte. All right, by Seurat. And what was going on at this time is there, of course, was a heavy influx of discoveries in science. And sciences are going to make folks really curious about color. And there's an emphasis on how color is perceived by everyone. So there's going to be something called color theory that's going to be developed from this. A lot of folks at this time in the art field knew about what were the primary colors like red, yellow, and blue, what the secondary colors are, orange, violet, and green, and then what complementary colors were like red to green and yellow to purple and blue to orange. That was a very well-known element of discussion. And but there's going to be a development in new emphasis on what's called saturation and value, all right? And this saturation and value is going to move into new types of contrasting colors. And again, this is called color theory. And I'm going to talk about how Seurat is going to use all this in figure 28.18. So everybody knew about these hues, and hue is another name for a color, like red. There's a red hue. There's a blue hue. There's a yellow hue. And the only things that are not hues that we in painting are gray, white, and black. Those are called neutrals. All right, those are not technically hues. They're achromatic, meaning that they don't have color in them. A color generates a hue. All right, H-U-E, hue. But red, white, and gray are neutrals. They're not considered hues. And with each hue, like a blue or a green or a red or a yellow, you can change the brightness and the dullness of it, and that's called saturation. The saturation of the hue, right? So these discoveries and these color theories and these discussions on saturation, and the other one is value, which is the light and the darkness of the hue, how light it can be and how dark it can be by using black and using white, using neutrals to span the value of it. Discussions on the saturation and this value is going to have a lot to do and yield into two different types of contrasting colors. One is called simultaneous contrast, and the other is called successive contrast. I'm giving you this whole color theory background because Seurat is really going to emphasize this in this painting. All right, and Cezanne will as well. Again, by using analytical studies in science and optics and how optics can change based off of color, all right, the physiology of your eye, the cones and rods, are going to make that analytical referencing available in these post-impressionist paintings. So what Seurat is studying from this color theory is, again, simultaneous contrast and successive contrast. Now, what simultaneous contrast are is when you put, and look at the painting in figure 2818 whenever I'm talking about this, when you put light green up against dark green, they will respectfully become either lighter or darker when they're next to each other, when they're adjacent to each other. So when you look at a Sunday on La Grande Jatte and you see the light green in the middle ground, and it creates a line into what would be called a shadow line, right, into the dark green in the foreground, at that line the dark green feels darkest and then the light green feels lightest. All right, so they, by being next to each other, create this simultaneous contrast. Though it's the same hue, it creates this simultaneous contrast. All right, so that's an example of that. Be able to know and look at this painting and talk about what the simultaneous contrast is. Then the successive contrast is when you stare at a color or a hue, let's say green. If you're looking at the dark green and you stare at it for a long period of time, and then you go to the white of the little girl's dress in the middle, after you stare at it for a long period of time, your eye will quickly perceive red. It will quickly perceive red. So through these scientific studies of color as well as optics, this painting has come to be. All right. So he'll combine all of these things I just talked about in this painting. The successive contrast, the simultaneous contrast, and the developments of these perceived colors throughout the whole composition. Now, one thing I haven't talked about, which really makes this super analytical, is that it's pointillism. P-O-I-N-T-I-L-L-I-S-M. Pointillism. Now, what does that mean? That means that each area of shifted saturation and value in the hue is one blot of paint from the tip of the brush. One blot. So if you look at figure 28.17, you can see the individual blots of color building up to create the composition. Look at her hat. Right? Look in the umbrella, look in the trees. It's individual blots of color. So that is super, super mathematical, right? To the point, like not even a segment line, just a dot. Pointillism. So you have the embrace of color theory, and then you also have this invention of pointillism to create this sense of optics. Because your eyes naturally move in these cones and rods, and they focus on these little points. So he's moving emotionally the color throughout the composition with this series of color theory and this pointillism on how your eyes are picking it up. Okay, so it requires a long study. A 2 to 4 year study at that, because that's how long it took him to do this one painting. It's big, 6 feet, almost 7 feet by 10 feet. That's big. That's a big painting with all these individual dots. All right, and I should mention that most stuff right now during this time is oil. All right, oil on canvas. Oil on canvas. So that use of the oil that we got from the European Renaissance, Northern European Renaissance painters in Flanders has just completely taken over everything. All right. So this is an analytical study, all right, on re-emphasizing the use of line, the use of pattern and form and color. In this case, not line, but dots, and how those patterns of dots create form, and the use of the color theory for this post-impressionist painting by Seurat. All right. So let's get into somebody a little more expressive, like Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh. Figure 28.19, Cafe. Now, I'm going to break down Night Cafe because this might be a piece that many of you may not know. You will know figure 28.20, Starry Night, but what I discuss in 28.19, Night Cafe, you should be able, on the next quiz or in your series of questions, be able to take what I describe in Night Cafe and be able, on your own independently, transfer these concepts over into Starry Night. Because you know Starry Night, you've seen it, but I want to break down the similarities, though it's a totally different painting in Night Cafe, that you'll transfer over into Starry Night. Now, what Van Gogh wanted to do as a post-impressionist was, again, show expression with color and with line and with pattern and with form. He wanted it to be expressionist. You can even see in the lights, he's creating the effulgence of the lights and these dark, murky colors to give this sense of expression. All right, creating this illumination instead of blending it into the wall and having it disappear. He's almost having them stand out on their own in a very expressive, loose, patterned way. All right, so more expression. And what Van Gogh wanted to do, he wanted to confront nature with these levels of distortion, which kind of comes from the Romanticism period. He wasn't successful at all. All right, he sold one painting in his life. His brother ended up selling, everything, and essentially made him, world renowned after he left, after he killed himself. So he was not very successful, and a little crazy. And I think it was a clinical insanity that he had. I'm not quite sure, but that led to a lot of kind of depression and such. So, but he wanted to confront nature in a very distorted way. And how he did that in Night Cafe is, when you first look at it, it looks like benign subject matter, but it's actually a very innovative approach to questioning and exposing what the nightlife in France was like. Okay? So how he did that is, quote, he wanted to show an oppressive place, a place that would ruin oneself. So the expression that he had in his heart and in his mind in regards to what modernism was creating, it was creating debauchery, it was creating intoxication, it was creating frivolities that led to provocative activities. All right? And he felt that. And he wanted to express that. As a post-impressionist, he's going to express it through line and through pattern and form. And ultimately texture. And I'll explain. So again, like Gogh did with the rehearsal with the ballerinas, is Van Gogh is taking the scene and making something incredibly benign and austere like the floor and taking on most of the canvas. All right, so this sense of isolation. So with Gogh, it was about emphasizing the actions of the individuals and the perimeters and the margins. But here, in the margins are these slothful-like figures that are intoxicated and isolated and not really connecting with one another. So what Van Gogh has done is he's changed the expression of not energy, but of de-energized environment, marginal energy. Okay? Something that is on the margins, that doesn't really have much action to it. And he does that by making the floor most of the canvas, and then the figures in the margins at the tables aren't really connecting to one another, or they're sluggish, or they're looking down. You got a little bit of possible promiscuity going on in the back left corner, but it's mostly just isolated and almost distorted like disposition. So that's one thing he does that is very innovative, is not focusing on the energy of the people, but kind of the de-energized element of the people. And he wanted to, again, with the oppressive mentality that he was having towards what modernism was doing, this second industrial revolution was doing to society, he considered it madness. And so he wanted to transfer that expressive feeling of madness and emotion over into this painting by what I've already talked about, alienating the figures in the margins of the canvas, and then also slanting the table on that floor where it looks like it's going to slide off. And look, the shadow of the billiards table is greater than the table itself. Talking about the dark element of these objects that are drawing people in is far worse and more maddening than the object itself. So these objects have a quiet madness behind them, an oppressive madness behind them. And he's also using the color, vivid hues, like the red wall, which can be agitating, up against the turquoise-like ceiling. And he's doing sharp contrast of color, something that really wasn't done before. Henri Matisse will start to do that in the next chapter, right, with Picasso. And Van Gogh is using these sharp contrasting colors suddenly to give it a sense of just intensity, all right, to give more intensity to the scene. So he doesn't want to show energy and activity like we saw with the Impressionists amongst the people moving. He wanted to show energetic intensity in the oppression of the place, which is what makes it expressive. And that's why he's an expressive post-impressionist painter. Okay? So by building intensity in the color, the turbulent brush strokes that he used, and what he would do is he would literally squeeze the tube of paint onto the canvas, something most people didn't do prior to Van Gogh, and then just would quickly move the paint in a very turbulent and violent, heavy way. All right? And what that ultimately would lead to with Night Cafe, and definitely the other painting you're going to have to dissect yourself, Starry Night, is it leads to a buildup of pattern and form within the form, and creates a texture within the paint by it being so thick and heavy and turbulent in nature and building up the different colors. These vivid colors he's building up on top of one another, and it creates something called impasto. I-M-P-A-S-T-T-O. Impasto. Let me make sure I have that spelled right for you. I think I'm missing one letter. I-M-P-A-S-T-O. I have one too many letters. I-M-P-A-S-T-O. Impasto. Okay? So his heavy, violent, turbulent like brushstrokes are building up color hue to build this textured impasto. And Starry Night is actually close to 2.5 inches thick with oil paint. That's how turbulent and built up it is. So it's not just across the 2D board, it's also becoming more three-dimensional. Okay, so be able to compare what I just talked about with Night Cafe and transfer the ideas over into Starry Night. Right? That will be your duty. So now let's look at another analytical post-impressionist by the name of Cezanne. All right, and we'll start with figure 28.23. We're going to talk about Mont Saint-Victor, which is 28.24, but I want to talk about his basket of apples just real quick as a still life genre. And the reason I mention this is for two reasons. One is Cezanne started with everyday themes like the impressionist. So he was an impressionist, like this, a basket of apples, everyday themes, everyday activities, and try to capture that first quick impression of that activity. All right. And the thing is, with the still life, it allowed him to not only portray the everyday with that first impression. Now, obviously, when you do a still life as an impressionist, it's not really going to move very much. So the whole idea of trapping energy, emotion, and making something momentary and transitory in nature doesn't really fit well with the still lives. But he was still using the still life as quick sketches to move into his post-impressionist paintings, which we'll see in figure 28.24. So the reason I bring up the still life as the basket of apples is that it is an indicator on where he was practicing as he's moving towards a more structured way and a more formal way of painting. So it has an impressionist elements to it as a still life. So it was done very quickly and did a whole bunch of these still lifes very fast as an impressionist. But then he ultimately moves into his post-impressionist work, and that is he breaks from it, the impressionism. And the reason he breaks from impressionism, from doing a whole bunch of these still lifes and such, is to make more structured, formal, and long-lasting impressions. Okay? So by it being more formal, structured, and long-lasting, it became post-impressionistic. Right? Versus impressionistic, it's all about quick, in that moment, in that little flash of a second. That flash of a minute. But here he wanted to change that dynamic, and then we have Mont Saint-Victor 28.24, which reflects his post-impressionistic attention. Now let's see why and how he's being structured and formal here versus the still life of Basket of Apples that we just looked at. So what Cezanne didn't want to do, he did not want to focus on truth, actually, which was what Impressionism was the most of it. It's not just truth, it's like the substructure of truth, hence the sketching aspect of the Impressionist. But with the Post-Impressionist, with Cezanne, he was not interested in visual proof, but he was more interested in a lasting structure behind a formless and fleeting level of information for the eyes. So he wanted to structure the composition in a way to control, kind of scientifically, at least analytically, the use of pattern, the use of line, the use of color, and the use of shape as his instruments, his visual instruments. And he's using these structural techniques to control what is considered transitory, in transition, that is fleeting, and that is formless. Like a landscape, like the clouds going by, like the trees moving. He's trying to control it, structure it, make it more formal. And that's why he's a post-impressionist. And how he would do that when he would paint is he would take this painting, which is 2 foot, pretty much 2 foot by 2 foot, all right, well, almost 2 foot by 3 foot. And every time he's working on his section, he would stop and he would move the painting in visual with the section he's looking at and make sure that it was almost identical. Okay, not realistic, but the lines, the patterns, and the colors reflected what he was seeing. So he took a long time to paint this simple 2-foot by 3-foot painting. 2 years. Because he was very meticulously, like a scientific experiment that you have to do in a lab. You have to very meticulously add different chemicals to get a certain reaction. That's what he was doing. He was the chemical, the landscape was the chemical, and the painting was the reaction between the two. Okay? And he called this, when he would lift it and look at it, a motif, which is a study of a moment. M-O-T-I-F, motif. So there's words that we're coming up with that you might have used loosely in the past, like picturesque, meaning it's worthy of being painted, that we talked about last chapter. Now motif, which literally means a moment to study. That's studying moment. So he's trying to be a scientist and study that moment as a painter. So a motif. So this painting is all based off of several motifs, several moments that he's trying to structure in order. And he's creating an interrelationship with the line, and where we see that line in here is multiple perspectives of an object. So he does not have all these objects like the little houses and the roadways and the aqueduct that's in there. If you zoom in, you can see it. They're not all going to the same vanishing point. They're going in all different perspectives. So he's compositing multiple different vanishing points and different perspectives in this one landscape. So that's how he's structuring and formalizing line. Because every time you come to it, you may see a line moving in a different direction that you may not have noticed before. Then he structures and formalizes the use of plane. And how he does that is he uses entire flat brush stroke patterns. So when you look through it, it looks like a whole bunch of built up obscured rectangles, and because it's coming from the very edge, not the tip, but the edge of the whole brush as he moves it across. So before he lays it, he's ready to lay it. He puts his painting up to make sure that's exactly where that brush stroke, where that pattern from the brush stroke needs to be, and goes right into place. So that's why it took him so long. So that's how he's controlling plane, all right, and pattern. Then the last is he's controlling color. Now how he controls color is in two ways. He controls it in local color locations, and we talked about this, where local colors are your colors that are associated with that area. Like for example, on the earth or upon a farm, you might see more greens and browns and yellows. In the sky, you might see more blues, right? Or you may see more gray tones, blue tones, maybe slightly violet tones, right? Depending on if there's a rain cloud coming through. You know, whites, grays, blues, violets in the sky. Cool colors in the sky, more warm. Well, no, that's not always true. All right. But local colors or hues that are often associated with that area. But he does something else to control and structure the color and unify the composition. He wants to unify the whole composition. And how he does that is, first we looked at with the lines, by having the different angles and many different things. You can see that with the mountain, many different angles throughout the landscape, many different angles with the lines. The patterns with the brush strokes are applied in this rectilinear way upon the mountain, in the sky, and also in the landscape. And then the color, how he unifies it, is through something called non-local colors. N-O-N, local colors. Non-local colors. If you look at it, you'll see suddenly in different areas throughout the imagery in the landscape, there will be grays and blues. Those are often non-local colors associated with a field or with a forest. In the sky above the mountain, there are greens. There are greenish yellow. There's yellow in the mountain. There's green in the sky. That's the use of non-local colors to unify the landscape to the atmosphere in the sky, and the sky with the landscape, by using non-local colors. That's how he structures and formalizes the use of color. All right? I'll leave you at that with the Post-Impressionists. We'll get into symbolism and architecture, and that will conclude chapter 28.